I'm really delighted to welcome you all to a session now to actually talk about some of the specific challenges faced on the continent, on the continent of Africa, a continent which has got the lowest intra-regional trade in the world. Increasing trade between African countries offers great potential for building sustainable economic development and integration, and including higher wage jobs and unlocking greater business opportunities. I'm really excited to welcome our panel of speakers and our moderator who will introduce them. Judith Fesehay is the Trade and Development Manager at the International Centre for Trade and Sustainable Development. Over to you, Judith.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I would like to welcome everyone to this session. We are going to discuss about the African CFTA. And I would like to, first of all, start by thanking the EIF for organizing this very important session and for inviting me to moderate. I've had a keen interest, professional and personal, on regional economic integration issues in Africa. I've been following these issues for around 15 years. So in March 2018, when 44 African countries signed the African CFTA, it was a very exciting moment, I think, for anyone who has been working on trade and industrialization policies on the continent. The CFTA matters for very important reasons. First of all, to address the overlapping membership issues that is a problem for many of the countries on the continent. But to sign this agreement in 2018, it's particularly important for a number of reasons, and I will take just a couple of minutes to discuss them. The first reason is that, as everyone based in Geneva knows, there is very little progress at the WTO. So most of the action is now taking place in regional trade agreements and mega-regionals across the globe. As these agreements move towards WTO plus and WTO extra provisions, there is a real risk for many African countries to be marginalized from international trade. The CFTA is a very important response to this process. The second reason is that we know that most of the global value chains are actually regional in nature, and they are becoming increasingly so. Many companies are reshoring activities close to consumer markets, and that may be making it more difficult for many African producers to follow the traditional paths of export-led industrializations that the Asians have pursued in the past decades. The third reason is because of the economic transformation agenda that all of the African countries are pursuing. The industrialization is now on top of the economic agenda for the continent and for the individual countries, and the CFTA is a very important opportunity to promote regional industrialization and regional value chains. So having said this, we have possibly the best panel we could have to discuss these issues and to discuss the opportunities and the challenges of the CFTA and also the implication for the donor community. Let me introduce this excellent panel. Let me start with Mr. Michel Sebera, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Trade and Industry for Rwanda, Mr. Halise Ngagugu, Director for Trade Integration at the Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment for Tanzania. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Joy Kategehwa, Head of the Regional Office for Africa, UNCTAD. Mr. David Luke, Head of the Africa Trade Policy Center, UNSCA. And finally, Ms. Kanyayo Awani, Managing Director for the Intra-Africa Trade Initiative at Africa Exim Bank. Thank you so much for joining us. Before starting, I would like to address all the people watching us live and would like to invite you to pose questions. Follow us on Twitter and pose questions. We'll try to pose your questions to the panelists. You can put your questions following on the hashtag on Twitter on EIF Global Forum 2018 or hashtag Inclusive Trade for LDCs. So let me first start with the first round of questions, and then I will open to the public. And I hope this session will be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to, and I will encourage you to participate as much as possible. So let me start with the first question with Mr. Michel Sebera. Rwanda is one of the most interesting countries in terms of industrial and trade policy making. We know that you have been very innovative on policies to develop the tourism sector, the ICT, and now everybody, it's on the newspapers everywhere that you're going to receive a 20 million investment from Volkswagen for an assembly plant in Kigali. So my question for you is, from a national perspective, what do you expect Rwanda to gain from the African CFTA?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much, Judith, for introducing us. First of all, I would like to thank you all, and especially EI for inviting me. This is my first time to come and participate in such interesting discussions. It's always a pleasure to represent my country and to discuss about Rwanda and where we are from now. So before we start, let me take you back a bit and highlight some important dates. As you may know, the CFTA started in January 2011, whereby the African Union Summit endorsed the recommendation of the 6th Ordinary Session of the African Union Minister of Trade held in Kigali on 29th October and 2nd November 2010, whereby the objective of this meeting was to fast-track establishment of Continental Free Trade Area. The next date is January 2012. Again, the summit made of head of states and government focuses on the theme of boosting intra-Africa trade. The next one is June 2015, and the most important one is the recent one on March 21st in Kigali, whereby the agreement was signed by almost 44 countries among the 54 African member countries. So these data are very important for not only for us Africans, but for Rwanda. Why? Because we signed not only that agreement in Rwanda, in Kigali, but it was a push from all of us and African to be proud of what we have been able to do, because trade have been laid behind, especially in Africa. So it's time for Africa to wake up and to really make sure that we are trading among us as African, but also to see further and abroad. So it's our time as African, yes, but for that, we need to implement what we agreed upon, what was signed in Kigali. And for that, there is a political will. As you may know, as you just mentioned, Kigali, in Rwanda, for instance, we are really keen in implementing this agreement. And it's our obligation as only Rwandan, but also African, to make sure that this agreement will be implemented. So with a political will, with a focus, and working as a bloc, we can make it. So thank you.
My next question is for Mr. Gugu, and I will ask you to address the same issue from a Tanzanian perspective. So what do you expect to gain from the African CFTA?
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and good morning, colleagues. I also take this opportunity to thank the EAF and all the organizers for this opportunity for me, myself, and for the United Republic of Tanzania. For us, I think after what the intervention from my colleague, who we are all members of the East African community, I think my interventions will be in the context of what we have as EAC. I think it will be good to note that the East African community is negotiating the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, as a bloc. We have resorted to this approach because you may understand for us, we have already reached the level of a common market and a customs union. And therefore, even now, as we engage in the tripartite trade negotiations under the COMESA, SADC, and EAC, I think the objective has been to maintain or consolidate the acquis that we already have in the current architecture of these regional economic blocks. So for us as Tanzania, I think we see there's a lot of potential in terms of what we are to gain in the AfCFTA, looking into what we have already seen, what we have achieved, taking into account that Tanzania is a member of SADC and EAC. When we started the negotiation in these two blocks, I mean, there were a bit of worries as in terms of what we are going to lose in terms of revenue from import duties and all that, opening up or liberalizing more than what we were expecting previously. But what we have seen over the years is actually the opposite of that. Opening up of markets have created more opportunities for investment, job creations, and even the mobility for our people. I mean, the social welfare, the interactions have even been strengthened. And therefore, with over 1 billion of African population under the AFCFTA, I think the prospects are even more bigger than what we're having now. Thank you, moderator. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Our next question is for Dr. Kategehwa. There is an increasing understanding now that trade liberalization per se may not deliver on the expectations of Africa in terms of economic transformation and economic development. And indeed, the EIF is part of that acknowledgement to address the supply side constraints. So in your view, what are the critical accompanying measures that LDCs governments need to adopt in order to take advantage of the African CFTA?
Okay, well, good morning to you all, and thank you very much, Judith. I'm very pleased to be here. It's very familiar territory for me, having been until very recently a WTO official myself, so I'm happy to come back in this context. I think to answer your question, Judith, one has to sort of contextualize what is really at stake at the continental level if we get this right. And so if you want to understand it from the perspective of numbers, we're talking about 33% increase in intra-African trade, 3% increase in GDP, about 1.2% increase in employment, 50% reduction in trade deficit, 16 billion about in welfare gains. This is what we analyze as UNCTAD in terms of potential gains. Now, we also know that structuring the agreements is important, and we have done important work together with ECA. David is here, and myself, trying to structure the agreements, at least the first drafts that negotiators will use, in a manner that takes into account the need to attain objectives for structural transformation, etc. But as you said, that in and of itself might not be sufficient. And therefore, what must we do else? And here I'd like to stress 3 points. The first one is that trade agreements are only as good as they can be utilized. Now, we all know that Africa, LDCs, 33 of them on the continent, that the CFTA is an essentially LDC RTA. And we know the challenges they've had with utilizing market opportunities. The question of capacity to export is critical. And so for me, a critical accompanying measure is first and foremost to create, support, scale that which can be traded under the CFTA. That's one point. The second point is around infrastructure. My boss, SG Kitui, has a very interesting way of putting this, that the infrastructure of integration is distinctly different from the infrastructure of extraction. What does this mean? That if you have roads, rails, air transport channeled around taking products outside of Africa in terms of the current pattern we know as raw materials, it's a different type of infrastructure you will need to create connectivity between Uganda and Senegal. And so a huge investment around connectivity, infrastructure that brings Africa together, that makes it possible for Uganda's tea to reach Senegal, that brings to light the dream of Cape to Cairo, that brings to fruition AU priorities around infrastructure development, the Yamoussoukro Declaration around air transport and freeing the skies and so on and so forth, is critical. The third point is around finance. I don't think that there are any examples around successful manufacturing, successful services conglomerates that have developed and scaled off a cash economy. So credit is the lifeline of investment, it's the lifeline of infrastructure, it's the lifeline of business. And therefore, how do you create a facility that can give Africa's unique type of market players, i.e. SMEs, the lifeline of business? How do you create credit for African business to thrive, for African women to thrive, for African youth to thrive. And it's interesting that AfriExim is here. It will be interesting to hear what they have to say. But those would be my 3 points: production, infrastructure, and finance as accompanying measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Duke, one of the issues that we have seen on the continent is, well, that we have seen in any regional trade agreement, is that there are winners and losers within countries and across countries. And this has been an issue in some of the regional economic communities where some of the largest economic powerhouses have maybe gained a bit more than some of the other LDCs in the region. How is this CFTA process going to ensure a fairer distribution of benefits of the regional economic integration process across countries?
Thank you. Thanks also to the organizers at the EIF for inviting me. Well, Joy just said there are 33 LDCs, 22 countries that are classified as developing. So yes, this agreement does bring this mix together. But at the same time, this is an agreement within what I will call the African family. Even the biggest economies on the continent, South Africa, Nigeria, about 2% the size of the US economy, about 2% the size of the EU economy, and perhaps about 3% the size of the Chinese economy. So, you know, we're here, let's put the scale in some perspective. And the LDCs are not new to participating in trade agreements that include developed countries, developing countries. So within the East African community, within ECOWAS, within SADC, you do already have this mix. And yes, there have been challenges, but we also see some promising developments. You know, in SADC, we see Lesotho, for example, being integrated into South Africa's automobile industry, providing leather seats, providing some automobile parts. And we see in West Africa the food value chains that West African LDCs are very well integrated into these value chains. And then the LDCs themselves are leaders in some sectors. Let's not forget that. In air transport, Ethiopia is leading very clearly through Ethiopian Airlines and the associated companies. We see, again, you know, if you take financial services and logistics, we see Togo is emerging as an important player. So the LDCs themselves are leading in some sectors. But, you know, fundamentally, this, as has already been said, this is an agreement to open up intra-African trade. The average tariff between African countries is 6.1%. When Africa exports outside of the continent, the average tariff is 2%. And then, of course, there are the non-tariff barriers, which some even say are much more of a challenge than the tariffs. So these reforms, and by the way, these are reforms that have been generated internally. You know, it's the African governments themselves that are leading this process. So, you know, these reforms aimed at attacking these sorts of trade policy constraints and removing some of the obstacles that behind the figure that you quoted earlier, the low volumes of intra-African trade.
Thank you so much. For our last panelist, Ms. Anwani, I'd like to ask what is the role of finance and the private sector to make sure that this African CFTA actually result in increased intra-regional trade, and especially for the benefits of SMEs and women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll join the other panelists to thank the EIF for inviting AfriExim Bank. We are probably the unusual member of this panel. I mean, as been said, the CFTA is a demonstration of political will. It will have to be implemented. And implementation is going to come from the private sector, as well as the financiers and, the governments have, UNCTAD just talked about all the deficits, infrastructure deficit, infrastructure not being there to carry intra-African trade. The Continental Free Trade is an opportunity to expand our value chains. It's an opportunity to deal with supply-side constraints. It has to be financed, and the private sector have a huge role to play in development. Take, for instance, trade-enabling infrastructure. While the government might not be able to finance those things, but there can be arrangements around PPPs. Those PPPs will have to be financed, as it were. Expansion of value addition, productive capacity will have to be financed. Logistics and transportation issues will have to be financed. The trade itself will have to be financed. And that's where financing comes in. But I'll talk a little bit about what Afreximbank does, since I was challenged. So we in Afreximbank have positioned ourselves as a CFTA partner, and we built a current strategy around 3 pillars, or 4 pillars, but 3 are the ones that are important to this audience. The first one is to promote intra-African trade. The second one is industrialization and export development. These are necessary ingredients for the CFTA to work. And the third one is trade finance leadership. What are we doing in those fairs? In the context of intra-African trade and export development, some of the initiatives we have are development of industrial parks, actually being a developer of industrial parks as a way to take advantage of the delocalization of manufacture of jobs from China and elsewhere, as a way to also use our competitive advantage in the form of labor that we have, and focus on light manufacturers, which is agribusiness, and light manufacturers, garments, toys, and what have you, which also are all areas where women and SMEs are involved in. The other thing we're doing also is promoting export trading companies. SMEs in themselves are not necessarily skewed towards doing international trade or cross-border trade. So we're trying to promote and finance and promote export trading companies such that they can go and buy off these SMEs, aggregate and do the exports, whether intra-Africa or even outside of Africa. So we're actively promoting that. This morning I just came from Amsterdam, where the Factors Chain International has held its 50th anniversary. I also wear another cap where I'm the chairperson of the Africa chapter of FCI. Factoring is an alternative trade finance instrument that is needful in the context of integration. In the EU, nobody trades around on LC basis. They are the best form of integration that we can talk to. They do open accounts. In Africa, we trade on using letters of credit. That makes us uncompetitive from the get-go. So we're trying to actively to promote factoring. Today, Africa accounts for a paltry 1% of factoring volumes. Factoring is a service, it's not a banking product. What then that means is that, so those who are, who have inertia about going into banks to take loans because of the abundance of requirements that banks will ask, can actually go to factoring businesses, and they will discount their receivables, as I was trying to tell you earlier today, on the back of the buyers. So it helps them manage their cash flows. They sell, a factor, provides liquidity for them to go and do the next business, and ways to collect the receivables from probably the bigger, more superior buyer. So we're actively promoting that on the continent, and we have set ourselves a target that by 2021, the factoring volumes will move from 1% in Africa to 5% at least. The other initiatives that we have to support, we're also doing not just finance, but we're also actually actively training, providing training. People need specific training to export within Africa. It is a different kind of skill. So we are also doing that, especially around, we started with Egypt last year. It's not something that we've done over time, but we started with Egypt last year, and the idea is to roll it over around many African countries. The reason I need to step back a bit, I talked about SMEs and is because SMEs actually, as we know it today, are mostly women. And then the other thing we're also doing is, looking to formalizing the significant informal trade. Some statistics will put it at about $40 billion today. The biggest traders in informal trade are the women. How are we doing that? One of the things we're also trying to introduce is a payment platform. So what a payment and settlement platform, what that will do is that these traders and SME players can actually buy and sell in their local currencies. That way we'll deal with issues around multiplicity of currencies, the foreign exchange issues. And I think I'll just stop there for now, maybe till the next round.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor for questions now. I'll take 3 questions, and then I'll ask the panelists to address. I'll give the panelists an opportunity to respond. Is there any burning question? Okay, so I'll take 1, 2, and 3, and then the next round I'll move this side. Yes.
Good morning, Mohammed Yassin, University of Udine in Italy. I'm just in dilemma about the regional integration of Africa. In Africa, we have 7 regional economic blocks: SADC, ECOWAS, East Africa Community, Maghreb, SINSAD, and all of these blocks. In these blocks, there is a problem of overlapping and fragmentation. I see my fellow of Tanzania and Rwanda sitting here. They are part of 2 blocks, but there is no synergy or coordination between the 2 blocks, and this is goes also to the other African members in this. As the minister said that it is time for Africa to wake up, but to wake up, we have been waiting too long, and I don't think that there is lack of political will. There is political will. Last, every African leader comes and delivers a speech. Last week, President Kagame and other African leaders in Brussels, they deliver us inspiring talk about the need for the unity and integration. But when we come to the reality and promotion of trade and development, we're stuck with different barriers. So, in your opinion, what is the possible unifying factor to enhance this regional integration in Africa? We see in Europe, they have unified around the steel and grow up. This is important. Just give me two minutes. 1 minute. So, I will. What is a possible unifying factor for that? And then the other question goes to Professor Luke. When you meet these African leaders in the African Union, and they talk about this and talk about creating these blocks from Cairo to Cape Town and this, what is missing for them when they make these declarations that they want to accelerate the African unity in order to create economy of scale, transformation of Africa, scaling up of their potentialities, and all these good reasons to push forward. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Gilson. I'm from Cabo Verde, coordinator of EIF in the country. So I would like to talk about the country islands like Cabo Verde and some other islands. So in the Continental Free Trade Area, what are the considerations about these countries that it's separately from the continent? So we need to take in consideration their specificity in terms of connections in this matter. So our highways are the seas. So for us, we are exporting and importing more from Europe than from Africa, and it's one of the cases that mostly happen in Africa. So the inter-regional trading, it's still weak. So we would like to know what are the Continental Free Trade Area, in your opinion, about this lack of breach and connections. About Afreximbank, as you know, Afreximbank opened some lines of credits in Cabo Verde, but I think those line of credits are too big for small and medium enterprises. So are Afreximbank thinking about open smaller or less amount credit lines that the small business enterprise can access to in good conditions? Because one of the problems in Cape Verde also, it's access to finance for the medium and small enterprises. And we are an open economy. We have companies that comes from Europe that has access to other conditions, and sometimes we cannot compete because we can even have access to those financing lines. So thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being here. I'm doing some great network connections, so thank you.
Merci, bonjour tout le monde. Seydou Ilboudo, directeur général du commerce, point focal du cadre intégré renforcé au Burkina Faso. Je voudrais remercier le Présidium pour les différentes thématiques développées et aussi remercier le cadre intégré pour l'invitation. Et surtout dire merci aussi à Madame Joyce qui, dans le cadre de la ZLECA, accompagne l'ensemble des États de l'Union africaine dans le cadre des études que la CNUSED développe, mais aussi saluer M. Gougou plutôt, l'un des négociateurs de ZLECA, un ami avec qui on négocie fortement en tandem dans le cadre de la ZLECA. Félicitations à lui. On est tous unanimes que cet accord est le bienvenu au niveau de l'Afrique. Nous pensons que le cadre intégré devrait davantage s'intéresser avec ses partenaires à cet accord qui est déjà signé, comme l'a dit l'un des présentateurs du Rwanda à Kigali. Et nous pensons que la configuration africaine qui est composée de pays en développement et paiement, et la majorité des pays qui sont des paiements, nous pensons qu'il est très important qu'on puisse faire un programme spécifique quant à la mise en œuvre de cet accord qui viendra sûrement dans tout au plus une année, c'est-à-dire mi-2019, fin 2019. Donc pour moi, ce qui est très intéressant, c'est que déjà la configuration de ces accords ne donne pas assez de marge aux pays les moins avancés sur certains aspects, notamment quand je veux prendre du calendrier du démantèlement ou du schéma de démantèlement. Déjà, on veut aligner les pays en développement et les pays les moins avancés sur le même terrain. Et aussi les questions des délais de mise en œuvre. Sûrement, il y a d'autres avantages qui sont accordés aux pays les moins avancés, mais nous pensons qu'il va falloir accompagner les pays afin qu'ils puissent mettre en œuvre efficacement cet accord. Donc l'aspect que je voudrais insister, c'est qu'il puisse avoir un programme ou des programmes d'assistance sur des domaines spécifiques, notamment les services et les questions de mesures commerciales correctives où, je dirais, l'ensemble des États africains n'ont pas de compétences, quelques 2 ou 3 États, et la majorité ou la totalité des paiements n'ont pas de compétences sur les questions de mesures commerciales. Donc nous, on attire l'attention du cadre intégré pour qu'il y ait déjà des programmes dans ce sens. J'ai été un peu long, mais bon, le thème étant moi-même partie des négociations de la ZLECA, c'est bien que je puisse. Merci, Madame la modératrice.
Thank you very much. These are great questions. Who wants to start on the panel?
Okay, I volunteer myself. The first question from the colleague from the university in Italy about the RECs, the regional economic communities, the overlapping memberships, etc. Actually, I think it was Michel who said at the beginning that the dates are very important. The dates are important because this agreement has been negotiated with much speed. And that would not have been possible without the experience that had been gained in the regional economic communities. In fact, the draft text built upon what you might call the acquis of the regional economic communities. We also need to keep in mind that the regional economic communities are still relatively small. You know, the African economies are very small economies. And even when you aggregate them into these RECs, they're still relatively small. A lot of businesses still talk about not there being sufficient scale for the kinds of investment that they would want to make in Africa. So, you know, rather than, from our point of view, rather than seeing the RECs as a stumbling block, if I may put it that way, for us they've actually been a building block, a plus. And I think also it was Google who said that in the case of the East African community, they're even going into deeper integration through the customs union. So I would have a very different take on the RECs. Then very quickly, what is the unifying factor, unlike the EU that has started off as a coal and steel community and so on. So very quickly on this, the unifying factor is that the data shows us that intra-African trade, as small as it is actually much more diversified. We estimate it to be about 18% intra-African exports. But within that 18%, about 40% is value-added products. So that is the unifying factor. That is what we would like to grow through this agreement by bringing down the tariffs, by tackling non-tariff barriers. Then the last point in regard to Cape Verde. Actually, what we found during the negotiations was that the small island states had an offensive interest, especially around fisheries, and the way that the rules of origin for fishery vessels, how the crew, the ownership, the equity, and all these things which were put into the agreement. So that was where the most important offensive interests lay. And I think the small island states, especially Seychelles, that championed this aspect. So I think they got really what they were looking for. And then the very last point, Julie, I see you looking at me, has to do with the LDCs, the issue is by Burkina Faso. Actually, the agreement does say that for LDCs, they have 13 years to bring the tariffs on the sensitive products down to zero. They have 10 years for non-sensitive products. For the developing African countries, they have 5 years for non-sensitive products, 5 years for non-sensitive products and 10 years for sensitive products. So that was one way of trying to, through the time frame for tariff reduction to accommodate these differences. But again, this was a negotiation within the African family. It was not a WTO-type negotiation. So the leeway for special and differential treatment obviously was minimal. And if you take the agricultural sector, no African country is subsidizing on a major basis. The US puts wheat on the market at 33% below cost. You know, that's not happening in Africa, and the agricultural sector is important for all of the countries. So I think I'll just stop here in terms of responding to these few points.
Roy, please.
Thank you very much, Judith. Just a few additions. This question of what is the unifying factor is an important one. And when I look back at 2012, where we started, we were quoting numbers of 12% at the time, intra-African trade. Here we are, 2018, talking about 18%. So the numbers are growing. And that is just a global figure. So the energy of intra-African trade is happening, and that in and of itself is a unifying factor. And as David said, of that we see much more diversification, 46% in manufactures. So Africa is trading with each other. How much better if we brought down the 6% tariff that David spoke about to 2 and eventually to 0? So the facts speak for themselves in terms of the numbers. The second point to stress there is this question of Pan-Africanism, and I think it is one that really drives what's going on. That Africa has planned already from 1980, Lagos Plan of Action, already from 1991, the treaty establishing the African Economic Community to unite through trade integration. And so the CFTA is very much part of that. Also in line with this Pan-Africanism story is Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. Trade is a critical fast flagship in terms of a signpost that shows we're opening the markets, we can trade together. And I think the energy of Pan-Africanism is particularly important. It's hard to quantify it, it's hard to describe it, but to my mind, it's very much what is driving even the political leadership around this. The point I'd like to raise around the question of island economies is, and David has ably tackled it, but it's also to recall that as you have small island developing countries, you have LDCs, you have landlocked developing countries, you have developing countries that have huge poverty issues. And therefore, you're talking about an RTA, an FTA that is grounded in development objectives. And so how do you design it? The question of developmental regionalism becomes critical. And that is why in the design structure, there has been a lot to pay attention to in the architecture, allowing countries to pursue structural transformation. How do you do that? By accepting that some of the products will be phased down at a slower pace, the sensitive products. By accepting that even if ultimately we're aiming for 0, ultimately, because that's what an FTA does, that in fact in the unique context of Africa, that might not be possible. That you still need to attain Article 18 GATT type objectives, developing industries, protecting them as they grow, and therefore the excluded products. Will it be 1%? Will it be 3%? Will it be 5%? But the point to stress is that in the design and in the architecture, you take into account the fact that SIDS, LDCs, landlocked countries all have issues. And so you structure the agreement as a development promoting agreement. I couldn't agree more with the representative of Burkina, the fact that the enhanced integrated framework is a great opportunity to rethink how to position that initiative in terms of supporting the specifics of CFTA implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. To come back to the question from Ahmed Salam, thank you for that question. Actually, to complement my colleague here present, it's true that we have regional blocks. We have a lot of regional blocks. There is a need for us to harmonize our policies, and that's what we have been doing. But for information, the CFTA, the signed CFTA agreement in Kigali is handling all those issues. There is no overlaps as such, but we need as regional member countries to harmonize our policies and strategy to come together and to negotiate as a bloc, as my colleague just said. On the question from our colleague from Burkina Faso, actually there is no, I think there is a misunderstanding while what he was saying. There's no issue of putting the same, as we say, the same foot in development countries. Actually, the problem here is we have to take the journey all together, with not forgetting that we need to learn from our mistake. We need to learn from the developing countries like the EU, the regional community, EU, and so forth. But the most important thing is to make sure that all those mistakes they have been doing, or any mistake that they may do, as Africa, we should not do the same mistake. So we need to learn and also to make sure that we apply our own policies and strategies to make sure that Africa is moving as a bloc. So thank you.
Start the specific question from Cape Verde to Afrexim Bank about supporting. Yes, you asked whether that the lines we have to you are too big. I'd like to say that the lines we have to Cape Verde are the lines we've been asked, and they are all to support tourism, which is what you do most. So we have exposures of over almost $150 million in Cape Verde to support the development of hotels. Some of the conversations we've been having with you lately is to, focus on medical tourism as well. But those industries also, have value chain effect and, supply chain effect such that the suppliers to the hotels can also benefit, which is why we also had a conversation with the executive director of the central bank about enabling laws around factoring. I can't overemphasize factoring. And it also looks to me like probably the government also needs to organize itself to bring towards the needs of the SMEs. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'm a bit disadvantaged to speak on the last. So mine would be just to complement, at least on the 2 points that they've been raised. And the first one on the aspect of the unifying factor. I think a lot has been talked about the trade in goods aspect and the manufacturing sector. But I think for us, the experience we've got, I think there's also a lot of potential for unifying ourselves in terms of the services sector. And I think based on the current architecture of the agreement itself, we've already started prioritizing service sectors that we see there will be immediate results. Services like financial, business services, transport and logistics, and infrastructure and communication. These are some of the priority sector that we've seen would actually have greatest impact, just to begin with, in the negotiations. So I think that's something that I wanted to also add on. But with regard to, in regards to my colleague from Burkina Faso, I think what he said is quite right. And I think we would like also to give regards to UNCTAD, which have been quite close in following up the discussions, but also providing technical capacity building, particularly in areas under negotiation, services and other areas. So maybe this would also be an encouragement to the EIF to also be part of this process. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I will take another round of questions. Before I do that, I'd like to ask all the panelists to think about one question for the closing remarks, and I'll give you 1 minute each for this specific question. I'd like you to think of one key message for the Aid for Trade community that we have here. Here we have a very important opportunity to speak to the recipients of Aid for Trade, the people shaping the agenda, the donor community. What would be your key message in terms of what should be done differently or in addition to make sure that the CFTA delivers for the LDCs? So let me open for second round of question. Thank you. Do it. Okay.
Thank you, the moderator, and congratulations to the panel for their excellent input. I will take here my hat as a private sector. What I need is that the money reach the SMEs and the informal sector. You just said from the Exim Bank that the informal sector roughly represent 40 billion. What is going on then that we cannot access to that money? You have the MDBs who put money in place. Actually, cash is not a problem. Money is available. We really need to adapt the financial tools and also reduce the layer of intermediaries. Because if you come from the MDBs and then the FDIs and commercial banks, the commercial banks, they then lend the money to the SMEs. How do you track back to make sure that the money was put available, make it as a long term? Because the commercial bank keeps saying to us, as a private sector, that they don't have enough money. They have money in their banks for 3 months or 6 months. But at the same time, money has been made available for the private sector, but it doesn't reach us. So maybe we might use a new technology to track it, to make sure that the money, for instance, that you make available reach me on the field. And if not, you need to have a means of pressure that the commercial bank, otherwise we will never achieve that growth that we look forward. This is my first point. And it's a solution-driven, that session. In Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast and Mali, they just agree across border what we call the ESCABO, Sikasso, Bobo Dioulasso, and Korogo. Trade zone. And this is it's an example that can be, for instance, used in other regions and see what are the skills, what we can frame together and export within our own regions. I'm not even looking to go to the EU or where I have a lot of barriers, because in Burkina, simple example, we consume a lot of ananas that we can import from Ivory Coast. Those are the concrete examples that the EIF, for instance, need to highlight and go forward, because you do already have solutions on the field managed by our regional institution like YMU, and this is important to do. But again, I really would love to see the long-term finance made available at the African Union level to find something to track it back. Thank you.
Thank you, Moderator. And I would like to thank also the presenters. The trade grows if and only if the tradable goods and services are competitive. Dr. Joy indicated the 3 challenges: production, infrastructure, finance. These are the basic challenges that Africa is facing. Well, production can be improved by improving technology, by improving skill. Finance can be improved by improving also policies. But the basic problem, infrastructure, needs huge investment. In Africa, the main problem is infrastructure. Anything produced in Ethiopia cannot reach South Africa easily. It is rather easy to send it to China. Even after the CFTA, do you think that our problem can be easily solved to improve our trade without improving our infrastructure problem? How can we improve this problem, and how can we promote intra-Africa trade in the very short period? Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank our presenters. Joy alluded to the challenges, actually, that have been also talked about in terms of production infrastructure. Now, many African countries are in subsistence production. A number of countries. Therefore, they are not in cash economy. And really, to have benefits accruing from the CTFA, we need to bring most of these people into the cash economy in order to facilitate the trade. How do we really strive to achieve that? Because if majority of the people are producing for their own existence, and therefore the production is not for actually facilitating the trading between the countries or the intra-African trade, that is a big challenge. Subsistence must be overcome in terms of production, and I think this is something I would like the panelists also to actually comment on. Thank you.
we may try to squeeze another round of questions if you can be a bit concise in in addressing this, the second round, please. Who wants to start?
The question that was also put to me. You know, it's difficult to force a commercial bank that is owned by a private sector individual to force them to give you loans, because they're also, you know, bothered about risk appetite and profits. However, I think there is a space for development banks. And that's why I keep talking about developing alternative sources of financing around factoring. I can't say it enough. I can't overestimate it. Because that's where we need to go so that they can tackle the issues around the bankability of SMEs who are not even in the, you know, who cannot approach the banks to get loans. You know, we have to do that. There needs to be a, I definitely agree that there's a place for development banks to play a role, and that's why we're also trying to mobilize other DFIs, including the African Development Bank, to join us in developing some of these other alternative sources of lending that operates elsewhere, you know, because the banks are banks, you know, they're commercially oriented, you know, and also they're also worried about risks associated with some of this, you know, and also scale as well. You know, unfortunately, I don't have other than to say to you that we'll have to keep developing those alternative sources of financing as like factoring.
Then they should not go to you and ask you on our behalf for long-term and risk factors. So that is not fair.
Thank you. We have other two questions on infrastructure and subsistence and informal production.
Thank you, moderator. Maybe to complement our colleague from Exim Bank and to come back to the private sector questions. You know, in Rwanda, I will talk about our own experience. In Rwanda, we have the same problem. So what we did, we are encouraging people to, SMEs especially, to come into cooperatives or associations. So the more you are many, the more you will get easier the funds to help you and come up with your business. So another issue, I may say, we came up with a fund called EGF for exporters. It's called EGF. EGF, it's Export Growth Facility. We have certain criteria through Development Bank. Of course, it's not commercial, as our colleague from Exim Bank just said, to help those SMEs to come up with bankable project, but with the objective of exporting. So as a group, you are working as a group, as I was saying before, it will be easier for you to come up with a very nice project, and which, of course, you can benefit funds for dealing with the private sector. On the cross-border market, we have as you just said, in the West Africa. In Rwanda as well, we have the same thing. We came up with cross-border market with the support of EIF. Those cross-border markets it's a way of promoting trade between DRC Congo and us, but as well as other neighboring countries. And we got funds from EIF, and thank you for EIF for that. And we hope that this sort of doing business, because it's an informal sector, and people are crossing the borders, they want to trade, but they don't have enough infrastructure to come back to the infrastructure. So when you're investing in such cross-border market, you are developing the country, both sides, but also facilitate trader. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. Maybe to address on the issue of subsistence economies, I think again, also in the case of Tanzania, and I think this is also the approach that the AFCFTA is taking, is that for us, we have engaged into a grand agenda on industrialization. And for us, the focus is on those industries that use raw materials that are obtained within our domestic environment. And predominantly, these would be agricultural produce. And then the industries or the value addition on these resources or raw materials will be to those activities which generate higher job creation. So employment would be actually increased if this is done. So we think in this approach, it will be more inclusive, and more of these communities will be participatory, and their produce, their activities at the farm level would be more meaningful, much as their produce will be ensured, guaranteed markets, industries or factories where more value addition will be undertaken. So I think maybe that will be my input in this regard.
Thank you. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you very much, Judith. For me, I think it's very enlightening to listen to the experiences of Rwanda and Tanzania, and they tell me, they stress what UNCTAD has been stressing for a long time, which is that there is a critical role for the state to play in managing the growth of the economy. When you talk about the policies of Rwanda, the strategies of Tanzania, the resources they've put in place to channel and support cooperatives and farmers to connect them to markets, when we talk about the infrastructure that the representative of Ethiopia is talking about, these are not the sorts of things that private sector can drive solely. And so just to stress that as business thrives, the state must support, especially in creating the enabling environment, through policy, through strategy, through resources, to create the infrastructure that will connect Africa, as we're talking about CFTA at this point in time, but that will also create the possibilities for SMEs to have access to this money that is got in their name of development. Thank you.
David, could I ask you to take up the question on infrastructure, especially in relation to the Boosting Intra-African Trade Action Plan? Thank you.
Very quickly, Joy already alluded to, I think, quoting the Secretary General of UNCTAD, that the infrastructure for integration is different from the infrastructure for exporting extractives and commodities. The CFTA is not being negotiated and implemented in isolation of all the other factors that impinge on boosting intra-African trade. There is the Boosting Intra-African Trade Plan, which has 7 clusters. Infrastructure is one of them. But beyond that, there is also what is known as the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, the PIDA, which has a champion at the level of the AU Summit, which is the president of South Africa, and has a number of priority projects which are already being implemented. So the issue of infrastructure has been given much attention, because it's well understood that that is an important bottleneck.
Thank you. And I'm going to take advantage of my position to take one last round of questions. I'll ask everyone to be very concise, please. There was one question there, if I'm not wrong. Yeah? 1, 2, and 3. Thank you. Please be concise, because we are supposed to go for lunch. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la modératrice. Je suis du cadre, le coordonnateur du cadre intégré renforcé. Nous tenons à remercier sincèrement tous ces orateurs depuis hier jusqu'à ce jour. Je pense que le commerce est plus vieux même que le monde. Vous le savez vous-même. Donc, mais il est intéressant de savoir que le commerce vraiment sera basé sur des infrastructures. Sinon, il ne doit pas y avoir des opportunités. Et vous savez, du champ jusqu'à l'usine, tout ce process demande des investissements, de gros investissements appropriés, jusqu'à l'emballage, donc pour que le produit ait des valeurs vraiment comme il le faut. Je pense que dans ces cadres, comme venait de dire tout à l'heure un des orateurs ici, les infrastructures diffèrent. S'il s'agit des infrastructures de facilitation d'échange ou s'il s'agit des infrastructures de fabrication, ça diffère. Et là, je pense bien que nous, les PMA, on a besoin de ces infrastructures qui sont appropriées en ce qui concerne la facilitation des échanges, le port, etc., jusqu'à le flux du produit qui arrive dans un territoire. Donc, ça demande des infrastructures, vraiment, de routes, de contrôle, tout un tampon jusqu'à ce que ces produits rentrent dans l'autre pays. Mon pays, le Tchad, qui est un pays sans littoral. ça demande vraiment des infrastructures en ce qui concerne la facilitation des échanges. Et là, je pense bien que le Tchad, c'est un pays par excellence de l'agriculture et de l'élevage. Je pense que, je prends un simple exemple en ce qui concerne les infrastructures appropriées. Et là, je pense bien qu'en ce qui concerne l'élevage, supposons nous sommes 14 millions de Tchadiens.
May I ask you to be concise, please?
Merci. Donc, c'est pour vous dire que nous avons besoin du concret. Nous avons besoin du concret en ce qui concerne le commerce. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, moderator. I just want to also reaffirm the points raised by the panelists about infrastructure productivity that are required for the structural transformation. The only one point I want to, from the panel, in order to answer it, is how do we enhance coordination? Because at the moment, CFTA is as if it's a Ministry of Trade only agenda, yet the requirements for it to happen would need coordination from other ministries. How is the AU and others selling it to other ministries, especially at a national level? Because as was indicated, the state has to play a larger role in providing the necessary infrastructure. Thank you.
I would like to congratulate this excellent panel and to raise a question about regulatory reforms. Our panelists have already spoken about harmonizing policies and strategies and creating enabling environments. In a recent article in the Trade for Development News by the EIF, it gives an example of the dairy industry in one of the LDCs, where currently 42 inspections, permits, and licenses are required by 15 different institutions. The study found that 27 of those licenses were not even necessary. So my question for the panel is, what are the prospects for achieving regulatory reforms, and considering the strong attitude about the need for policy space, can we expect progress in this area? Thank you.
Who wants to pick up? Okay, thank you.
Chair, thank you. And maybe to briefly to respond to at least to the two issues that were raised. One, with regard to the coordination issue, I think based on the just ended ministerial meeting of the AFCFTA, I think there has been a directive to form national steering committee or national task force to oversee the implementation of the AFCFTA at national level. And the composition of these bodies would actually encompass all of the stakeholders at national level. I think that would be one of the ways to address the issue of coordination. And with regard to the issue of regulatory reforms, I think, yes, this can be tackled at both at the continental level and at national level. I think for us, in the case of Tanzania, I think just recently we were able to launch what we've called the Business Environment Blueprint, which actually addresses the issues that our colleague has just raised in terms of multiplication of the regulatory bodies in the countries, which in totality will amount to non-tariff barriers, if I may say so. And the issue of trade facilitation and non-tariff barriers is at the core of the current agreement itself, and these issues have also been looked at in detail at the current architecture of the agreement itself. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. To complement my colleague from Tanzania, actually, it's not only at the national level we have those steering committee, but for our member countries, especially Rwanda, what we are doing now is even international. When any of our ministers who is traveling or high official is going abroad, he has that obligation of sensitizing other people to make sure that the CFTA is implemented. So there is an harmonization and coordination not only at the local level, at the regional level, and above. On the question of infrastructure and productivity, it's true any economy has to be developed, it cannot be developed without infrastructure. So what we did is to come up with what we call industrial parks. We came up with different industrial parks within the whole country, but in different provinces. We have so far 9 industrial parks. As our colleague from Exim Bank said, you cannot be developed without investing heavily, of course, in infrastructure. But to do so, once again, we need the participation of private sector, as I was saying. The private sector cannot have enough money to invest in such big infrastructure, like to invest in coming up with a factory, because they don't have enough money. So what we are proposing them is to come up as a group, as I said, and to invest in those industrial parks. What the government is doing is to avail the land, basic infrastructure, which means road, water, electricity, and fiber optics, and then they can come and lease the land and come up with factories which will have a big impact to the economy and, of course, create jobs among our population. Not only jobs, but decent jobs. Thank you.
Just very briefly on the issue of coordination. Actually, the African finance and economy ministers met in about 6 weeks ago to look at how the AFCFTA would impact public finances, including the loss of revenue issue. And I think the report of that meeting makes fascinating reading. It's on the ECA website. But in a nutshell, they agreed that if you increase the trade volumes, that would in itself generate new sources of revenues that they currently do not have. They also agreed that that they would need to look to see what investments to prioritize that would support the implementation of the AFCFTA. They looked at issues like using VAT to replace tariff revenues. And the whole question, fascinating debates they had on the whole question of moving away from dependence on trade revenues to other types of taxes and so on. So, you know, you have a whole range of ministers. The justice ministers were the ones who did the legal scrubbing of the CFTA text. The foreign ministers, of course, were the ones who supported the summit in Kigali and so on. So a number of ministries have already been involved, not just the trade ministers.
Thank you very much. Now, to wrap up, we don't have much time. I would say that my key take-home message really from this session has been that the African CFTA is strongly embedded in an economic transformation agenda, inclusive economic transformation agenda. And in that sense, it has really the potential to be transformative in terms of really changing the economic structure of the African economies in an inclusive manner. We have heard a lot about SMEs, about women, and also looking forward in terms of the incorporating really the changing structure of production, of global trends. And this is why it's an FTA that includes discussions on competition policies, on regulatory cooperation, etc. However, we also, I think, established that 2 things need to happen. At the national level, we need industrial policies, we need agricultural policies, and as Tanzania rightly pointed out, we need effective services export strategies. We also need effective cooperation with the donor community, and we need to shape the aid for trade agenda in a manner that is supportive of the African CFTA. And I'd like to conclude with a 1 minute, please, message in terms of aid for trade and the EIF. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. The 1 minute, let me take this opportunity, first of all, to thank you for coordinating us. Also, to emphasize on the fact that the agreement, this African Continental Free Trade Area agreement has a long-term goal to deepen integration and reduce and eliminate tariff, as you just mentioned when we started, as the potential of boost the economic growth and member countries by strengthening their competitiveness. So my question will be, how fast and how best can we make sure that this agreement will be effective and will be effective in order to push us, Africa, to implement it? Thank you.
Moderator, thank you. I also briefly say that for our colleagues from the maybe Aid for Trade fraternity is to actually see the AFCFTA as a grand opportunity for them to participate in the building capacity of actually the state parties to the agreement itself, but also to the beneficiaries, the farmers, the traders, and all that. I think this is a grand opportunity for them, for the EAF and other donors to be playing their role in terms of ensuring that the AFCFTA delivers on its expectation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. In 1 minute, under a minute, I think that if we recall that Aid for Trade is ODA focused on trade, if we also recall that the EIF is Aid for Trade in action for LDCs, and if we try to square that around the conversation we've had on the challenges being infrastructure, being production, being finance, and if we see Aid for Trade as this spotlight that catalyzes and galvanizes all key partners towards a goal, mine would be to say that the Aid for Trade community has heard the message. The message is that we have done a lot in terms of Africa channeling its mind as to the legal frameworks that will progress intra-African trade. The role then for Aid for Trade is to support that initiative. We've done a lot already. If we look at GTAP days, if we look at the EIF, on the institutions, on the soft issues, the institutions, the inter-institutional committees, the policies, the DTISs, we know the analytics. It's time to move now into the action, into the production action. So for me, I would call for an Aid for Trade galvanized around supporting productive capacity in Africa to create the sort of production that will allow for utilization of the CFTA opportunities. Thank you.
I also agree with Joy, but I'll also add that even whether it is aid or finance from international community, it should be towards value addition and productive capacities, and not for financing of our primary commodities. Thank you.
I'm very happy to conclude with this message. Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you for the public for the excellent questions and interaction.
And thank you to the great moderator. I think we... what a fascinating discussion. I think, you know, what's clear to me is that the signing of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement by 44 nations in Kigali in March 2018 was historic. These political agreements are necessary, but they are not sufficient. And our challenge is to ensure that we support increased production, as Joy put so eloquently, which means supporting human capital, which means supporting people. That we get our investment in infrastructure within countries, between countries, within regions, across the continent, in place and beyond the continent. And that our finance is at the heart of that. And I draw us just back to a quote from Her Royal Highness from yesterday, where she said, when women entrepreneurs want small sums of money, if they're lucky, there's microfinance available. When they want $30 million to expand, they need to become a man. We have a long way to go, but we're a long way along that journey, and it's been fantastic hearing all the comments from the panel. We will break for lunch now. We're still acting, and we have another MOU that will be signed in action in the atrium between the EIF Secretariat and the Pacific Islands Forum. So please do join that. There'll be some remarks by some of the speakers there very briefly. And then we'll reconvene here at 2:15. A session in this room will be on strengthening inclusive agribusiness for growth. And there's another session on making connections between inclusive trade, economic growth, and the LDCs, which will be back in session room W. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you.